God, in these wearying times, we have gathered to be your people, to be your disciples, to learn what it means to take your yoke upon us, to find rest in you. Bless these human words that I speak, and the human hearts and minds that listen, that this might be a time where we hear your word and your calling for us, where we are transformed by the power of your Spirit and sent into your world as followers of Christ. In his name, amen. Masked, gloved, and properly sanitized, I entered Bernadette's living room, which was now her makeshift palliative care unit. The hospital bed crowded the space, and the supplies to keep Bernadette comfortable were spilling over the sides of a small coffee table. Sarah was holding Bernadette's hand and whispering, "It's gonna be okay, Mom. The priest is here, just like you wanted." When the nurse had come earlier that day, she told Sarah to expect death to pay a visit within 6 to 8 hours. And Sarah had called me. Remembering her Catholic upbringing, Sarah said, "My mother needs her last rites. She's asking for prayers. She needs the spiritual reassurance that she's come to believe would be hers in those final hours before her crossing. But I don't know. I don't know if you or any other priest would come out because of COVID." Dying is rarely easy, but the isolation of COVID-19 burdens a family in new ways. The nurse comes once a day for Bernadette, which is a miracle, since in some places home care has been impossible to procure. When Bernadette's cancer took a turn a few weeks ago, the personal care workers were nowhere to be found, so Sarah quit her job in order to provide this final act of care for her mother. She works from a binder left to her by the medical profession that tells her what to expect and who to call when death finally comes to take Bernadette. And despite the weight of it all, when I looked at her face, I saw peace in Sarah's eyes. "This I can do for my mother," she said. "I know you can," I said. "You are here. God is here. Bernadette has everything she needs." And as I said goodbye and I closed the apartment door, an image came to mind of a river of spirit carrying Sarah and Bernadette's souls through winding valleys shadowed by death, their bodies tired, but their souls resting in God. We're going to be okay, I thought. God is here. Long ago, St. Augustine spoke of Christ being our true Sabbath. But it strikes me now, as I look around, that all too often the church waters down Jesus' message, exchanging Christ's living water that quenches the soul and the thirst for a cheap grace that needs replenishing as often as toilet paper. For example, when I went to find an image through Google Image for today's scriptures, I was left with a queasiness inside. I worry that our church is selling people a false sense of spiritual rest, because these are beautiful pastoral scenes, but they have very little to do with the rest that Jesus offers us. To me, these are instead images of what Bonhoeffer calls a cheap grace, a grace without discipleship, a grace without the cross, a grace without Jesus Christ. It's comfort for the body, but not necessarily the rest that our souls need in the crisis. It's the kind of image that might grow a church congregation in the good times, but rarely leads to Christian disciple time in the crisis time. The rest that Jesus offers us is not a vacation. It isn't about setting aside the laptop and the dishes to be idle. It's about coming in close, finding the flow of the Spirit, being in joyful sync with God, and feeling the fullness of Christ's presence in our life. It's Sarah holding a dying Bernadette and knowing that all will be well. It's this church, despite the financial constraints, knowing that our job is to go out there and care for those hardest hit by COVID. It's Mother Pollard, who at age 72 said, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." The year was 1956. And like so many other Black Americans in Montgomery, she was boycotting the bus systems that were segregated and walking to every one of her destinations. And when her pastor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., suggested that perhaps, for the sake of her health, she should consider taking the buses, she replied, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Mother Pollard was always saying things like that to her pastor. One night, following a tension-packed week of being arrested and receiving many threatening phone calls, the Reverend Doctor was speaking at a mass meeting at his church, and he tried to convey strength and courage, though inside he said he felt depressed and fearful. And when the meeting wrapped up, Mother Pollard came to him and she said, "Come here, son. Something is wrong with you. You didn't talk strong tonight." And trying to hide his fear, he replied, "Oh no, Mother Pollard, nothing is wrong. I'm feeling as fine as ever." "You can't fool me," she said. "I know something is wrong. Is it that we ain't doing things that please you? Or is it that white folks is bothering you?" And before the Reverend Doctor could respond, she looked him directly in the eyes and she said, "I done told you we is with you all the way." And then her face radiated light. And in quiet certainty, she said, "But even if we ain't with you, God's going to take care of you." And many years later, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "I've been tortured without, I've been tormented within by the raging fires of tribulation. I have been forced to muster what strength and courage I have to withstand the howling winds of pain and the jostling storms of adversity. But as the years have unfolded, the eloquently simple words of Mother Pollard have come back again and again to give light and peace and guidance to my troubled soul. God's gonna look and take care of you. God's gonna take care of you." And if we are gonna call ourselves Christians, my friends, we had best commit ourselves to a process of discerning the difference between the comforts of this world and the needs of the souls, between the marketing of cheap grace and the deeper calling of Christ from the cross. Christ's yoke might be easy, but it is still a yoke. There is still heavy lifting and a pulling in the direction of God that, while leaving you at odds with the world dominated by greed, will fill you up with the tired ache of a job well done and the quiet certainty of a soul at rest in the Creator's love. Little church in the midst of a pandemic, in response to God who works through us to build the kingdom, let's echo the voice of Sarah and say, "This I can do." Let's work under God's yoke until our feet is tired, but our souls is rested. Let's trust in the promise that God's gonna take care of you. Now we hear God's call to love in the midst of suffering. Let us take on Christ's yoke as our answer.